Public radio is radio that matters, and our sustainers keep it going strong year after year. Thank you for your support of WFIU.
From WFIU in Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Kate Young, and this is Earth Eats.
We know that there are all sorts of good chemicals that come out of the dirt and working the land and working with plants that are beneficial to our mood and our health. For refugee populations that have had to be on the run, who have had to live in refugee camps for decades, having a little piece of land that you can tend to, that you can take care of, and then see the results and not feel like you're going to be bombed out the next day, it brings a kind of peace of mind and a little bit of healing.
This week on the show, Professor Tammy Ho of University of California-Riverside shares her ongoing research about refugees from Burma and the surprising ways they participate in the U.S. food system. Stay with us. Thanks for listening to Earth Eats. I'm Kate Young. I'm always thrilled when I have the chance to talk with someone whose work lands at the intersection between food and broader social issues. My guest today is Tammy Ho, and her work looks at communities of recent immigrants and in particular refugees from Burma and their participation in food systems here in the U.S. I'll let Tammy Ho introduce herself.
I actually have 3 different names, but my English name is Tammy Ho. I publish under Tamara Ho, but on my birth certificate, my name is Tammy Ho, and I'm moving to publishing more under Tammy Ho. I'm an associate professor of Gender and Sexuality Studies at University of California-Riverside. I was born in what used to be called Burma. The country has now officially been renamed Myanmar. So I was born in Burma in the capital city of Rangoon, which is now called Yangon. And my parents and I left Burma in the early 1970s during a period of escalated kind of anti-Chinese violence and hostility that went hand in hand with both the post-colonial government and the military coup that had happened in 1962, because the military was hostile to what they considered middlemen, the populations that had somewhat benefited in their minds under British colonialism, which meant the Chinese, people of Indian descent, people who weren't Buddhist. The military actually passed a law that said that if you were Chinese, you could not go to college. Like, you just weren't allowed to enter higher education. And part of that was an attempt to respond to what they considered differential privileges under British colonialism. So my father wanted his children to be educated, and so he applied to immigrate and work outside of Burma. My father was a medical doctor, and the U.S. had an immigration window that allowed professionals from Asia to come. So we left Burma and moved to Albany, New York. We ended up moving to California, where I was educated and raised. I got my PhD in comparative literature at UCLA, but my education at UCLA was very interdisciplinary. I specialized in post-colonial literature in English and French, and did work in ethnic studies and feminist studies. And then I ended up at UC Riverside. I am a professor of Gender and Sexuality Studies. I teach all sorts of interdisciplinary classes on gender theory, on feminist epistemologies, literature by women. Probably about 10 years ago, my department took an interest in sustainability and ecofeminist climate change issues. And so we started designing classes that were more oriented towards thinking about the environment. And one of the classes that we introduced was a class on food, which I started teaching. So I teach a class at UC Riverside called The Feminist Politics of Food. And so I have long been a fan of food scholarship and food studies. I am a big fan of food in general. And then during the pandemic, I was part of a writing group that it just turned out the other members of the writing group were all doing projects on food. And so I had originally thought I was going to do another project on religion and interreligious political solidarity within the Burmese diaspora and Burmese population. But the food kind of peer pressure won out, and I pivoted to start writing my thoughts and observations about Burmese food and Burmese immigrants and refugees and how their lives had been shaped by food-based employment or certain projects like community gardens.
Tammy Ho visited the IU campus in January of 2024 and gave a talk about her work. She offered background information about Burma to help the audience understand the context of her work.
I find that it's useful to introduce Burma just because most Americans don't know a lot about it. So during the period of the dictatorship of Ne Win, who was the general who took over in 1962, Ne Win was very paranoid. So he basically closed the country for almost 20 years. There was only one plane going in and out of Burma, I think once every 2 weeks. It was impossible for those who had left to come back because they didn't want outside ideas coming into the country, because the military that had taken over was very bitter about British colonialism and what they felt it had done to the national culture. So they were very anti-Western, anti-outsider, anti-international, despite the fact that Burma had been part of the 1955 Bandung Conference, which was a gathering of non-aligned countries that did not want to declare themselves either capitalist or communist. In the 1960s and 70s, Burma was officially a, quote, socialist country, although the socialism was overshadowed by military dictatorship and corruption. So growing up in the United States, I knew that we sent and got letters from relatives who were still in Burma, the little blue foreign airmail stationery that used to be the kind of standard for international mail. But I also knew that the letters had been opened, that there were censors who always opened the letters, and that communication with Burma was always under surveillance. So even when we sent letters to, say, like my grandmother or my uncles, it could take 1 to 2 months before we got a reply. So growing up, I did not meet a lot of Americans who knew anything about the country. They would ask me, "Where are you from?" And I would say, "I'm from Burma." And they would say, "Well, is that part of China? Is it a city in Thailand?" And I said, "No, it's a whole country." So in my scholarship and in my talks, I try to provide a kind of basic introduction for those who might not know much about the country. So Burma is a country about the size of Texas, has 55 million people. But what's interesting about Burma is that it officially recognizes 135 ethnic minorities or ethnic populations. So this is quite confusing for a lot of folks who can't imagine that level of diversity within a country that they imagine is monocultural. When the government took over, the predominant majority, the ethnic majority, is called Burman in English. It's called Bama in Burmese. And so those are the folks who run the military. Those are the folks at kind of the top of the hierarchy in terms of wealth, in terms of power and influence. And then the ethnic minorities, which include Karen, Chin, Mon, Shan, those populations have their own languages, their own cultural traditions. They would like to have their own territory, and they do have designated, quote, states in Burma that are not independently or autonomously run, but they would like to be. So that's the source of a lot of the civil conflict and fighting and militarized violence that happens in the country is over control of territory and resources. So the ethnic minority populations would like to be autonomous, retain their language, retain their traditions of dress, diet, rituals, religion. But the central government wants the country to be Buddhist, and they are run by the Burma or Burman majority. Many ethnic territories, especially those that are resource rich, have been continuously bombed, villages burned, men and children conscripted into labor for the military to carry stuff for the military or to build roads or whatever infrastructure the military finds necessary. And then the stories of sexual assault and rape as a weapon of war, as well as imprisonment, torture, genocide, have been unfortunately prolific in Burmese history over the last 6 or 7 decades.
So the kind of ruling majority wants a unified culture?
Yeah,
somehow?
so
Or they just want control over those?
both. Yeah, so there's a level in which Burmese folks from the country of Myanmar understand that there's an ethnic diversity, but there's also a hierarchy. So some populations are considered more, quote, backward. So although they're recognized as indigenous and or native, they're not considered as advanced intellectually or cognitively. There's, certain populations that tend to be more limited in terms of educational opportunities, who are sort of consigned to hard menial labor or domestic labor. And some monks are friendly with the military. In other words, the military ostensibly is Buddhist and supports building of pagodas or donate to monasteries. And some monks are very nationalist, very adamant that the country needs to be Buddhist. But at the same time, there are also monks who have stood up to the military.
So because of all of the religious and ethnic persecution within the country, a lot of people have fled or have been driven out, or?
Yes, so both. The ethnic minorities that are predominantly Christian, who tend to be Chin, Karen, those populations were exposed and took in American missionaries who were Christian, who were Protestant, Baptist predominantly. So those populations are predominantly Christian, although some of them are also Buddhist and or animist. And obviously, being Christian in a country that wants to be Buddhist, that is politically and ideologically Buddhist, is challenging. So when my parents were growing up in Burma, there was sort of a proliferation. It was okay to go to either the monastery and the church. There were interreligious families. People went to different religious spaces for social interaction or good food. So there wasn't the level of hostility that has taken place in the late 20th century and certainly in the 21st century. So those areas have been, as I mentioned, bombed, villages burned, people literally driven out of their homes, either because some of the ethnic populations also have their own resistance militias or guerrilla forces that are fighting against the central military. There's ongoing fighting. There is warfare. And a lot of civilians who may not be directly involved can still lose their homes or get beaten up if the army's coming through and they feel like, oh, this might be a stronghold for one of the ethnic armies. Some people are literally forced to leave because their homes are burned to the ground and they have nowhere else to go.
And so there are extensive refugee camps in Thailand mostly, or other places as well?
A number of refugee camps exist along the Thai-Burma border, although there's also a huge refugee camp in Bangladesh at the Bangladesh border. And that is predominantly where the Muslim minority population, known as the Rohingya, have been kind of driven or have a lot of the refugees who are Muslim have ended up in the refugee camps closer to Bangladesh.
Is that Cox's Bazar?
That's Cox's Bazar, yeah.
Tammy Ho's current research is focused on refugees from Burma living in the U.S. and the places where they're involved in food systems. So far, she has identified 3 case studies.
Specifically, sushi entrepreneurship, employment in corporatized meat processing, and then community farms, or refugee gardens, as they're sometimes called. These three particular case studies, I tend to kind of think of them as two sides of a coin in terms of kind of the American dream, but then also American nightmares. The sushi entrepreneurship is very much a kind of American dream narrative, where the sushi rolling phenomenon among Burmese immigrants was started by an immigrant by the name of Philip Mong, who arrived in California in the late 1980s, and he ended up getting experience and employment at a Southern California sushi company that was owned and started by Japanese immigrants. And so he worked at Advanced Fresh Concepts and then decided that he could borrow their model of sushi counters and franchising that are located at grocery stores, which were just starting to take off in the 1990s as sushi became more popularized and more normalized as part of the American diet. Mong took his experience and knowledge from his employment at Advanced Fresh Concepts. He went off to North Carolina to try and start his own company. He started Hisho Sushi and was able to partner with some independent grocery stores there after he had to max out his credit cards and live in his car, as the narrative goes, because he couldn't get loans from banks to support this endeavor. So he started with a few sushi counters at grocery stores and was able to grow his business by employing other new immigrants from Burma and Myanmar. The thing about sushi rolling is that it doesn't take English to do it well, and he was able to kind of teach the skill to make the sushi and the kind of business model of running a counter to new immigrants from Burma. He was very successful. His business was recognized by Inc. magazine as one of the 5,000 fastest growing businesses between 2010 and 2018. And he made millions rolling sushi. And so sushi rolling became a kind of niche form of employment for many Burmese immigrants coming to the United States who didn't otherwise have other opportunities or connections. So growing up, I remember hearing these stories of so-and-so does sushi rolling, so-and-so is rolling sushi. And I'm like, wait, but sushi's not an indigenous Burmese dish. But you can learn how to do it, and many Burmese did. Some Burmese started their own companies and were rolling at home and selling to markets or putting their rolled sushi in markets for American consumers to purchase on their way to work and with their busy lives.
So do you think this whole kind of tradition of this being a thing that Burmese immigrants do comes just from this one guy?
Well, I'm still in the process of doing the research, honestly. The trail that I have followed has been predominantly journalistic. So I haven't done intensive historical research. But there have been many reports in the New York Times and various newspapers, as well as industry recognition, as I mentioned, Inc. magazine, that have celebrated Mong's success story. And I know anecdotally from conversations within the Burmese diaspora and among Burmese immigrants that the sushi rolling is far more prolific than most non-Burmese realize. It seems so. Yesterday, I met 3 Chin students who are undergraduates here. All 3 of them had sushi connections. One of them said, oh, my mother used to roll sushi. The other one said they had a cousin who had rolled sushi. One was dating a guy who was rolling sushi. So once you start the sushi conversation, it seems like everybody has some kind of sushi connection.
You know, and it's also funny when you said this isn't an indigenous Burmese food tradition, but, you know, just hearing about how many ethnicities and there's so many different cultures, you could sort of picture, well, maybe one of them has sushi in there, you know, or something. But you're saying that's not it. It's an American thing. It's something that happened in America through a connection to a Japanese sushi company.
Right.
That then someone was like, hey, we could do this too.
Yeah. So,
But it could have been a burger joint, or it could have been
Right.
something else. But this is what it happened to be, and it
Yeah.
worked.
right. And there's a parallel story in terms of Cambodian immigrants and donuts. I don't know if you heard that story.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So
Okay.
there's a acclaimed documentary called Donut King that covers this history about sort of, as I mentioned, a parallel story of a Cambodian immigrant. I believe he worked at Winchell's and then decided I can do this on my own. And then he started making donuts, and then he taught other Cambodian immigrants how to make donuts, and he started franchising, and he also became a millionaire.
Right. So it's really kind of about the food entrepreneur who achieves success.
Mhm.
Whatever food it is they've grabbed onto,
Right.
it's going to spread throughout the community.
Mhm,
and it sounds like not just in California, but like all over.
Right.
Yeah, that is super interesting.
And to return for a second back to the point about sushi not being indigenous to Burma. So most Burmese populations, to the extent that I know, I mean, I don't know all the ethnic populations. I'm not completely fluent in all their cuisines. But for the most part, Burmese folks don't like to eat raw fish, or that's not part of the traditional Burmese diet. Most of the cuisine coming out of Myanmar or Burma is based on stews or soups, salads, but even the salads, the protein tends to be cooked. Raw fish is not, I haven't seen it outside of sushi rolling.
The widespread adoption of sushi rolling franchises in the Burmese diaspora is one of the 3 areas Tammy Ho is researching. We'll hear about the other 2 after a short break. Stay with us. Kate Young here. This is Earth Eats. And my guest today is Tammy Ho, professor of Gender and Sexuality Studies at UC Riverside. Her current research project looks at Burmese refugees in the United States and their participation in our food system. She has 3 case studies. One is sushi entrepreneurship, which she touched on before the break. The second one involves community gardens. Here's Tammy.
Part of what led me to these 3 was my examination of the movie and nonfiction book called All Saints, which was about a real-life situation that happened in Smyrna, Tennessee, where a small Episcopalian church was basically about to go under because the congregation had dwindled down to about 20 people. Most of the parishioners had left to go to a neighboring church, and so the Episcopal Church was going to sell its property and close down the church. So they assigned a new priest just out of seminary to sort of watch over the land while they proceeded with the sale. And as he was running the church and offering Mass, a Sunday service, a number of Karen refugees came in to attend the service and then proceeded to ask if they could not only gather some of the plants on the church property just to eat for themselves, which the Americans thought was quite odd because they're like, why do they want the weeds in the parking lot? But then they also noticed that the church had about 20 acres, and so they asked if they could plant crops on the land for their own consumption. Initially, the priest, as well as the Episcopalian bishop, was not enthusiastic about this idea. They didn't really even understand who the Karen were or where Myanmar or Burma was. But these refugees insisted that they were Christian and coming out of an Anglican tradition, which in American terms means Episcopalian. So they agreed to let the refugees start growing plants on the church land. They used land that I guess had been a soccer field owned by the church.
Yeah, so it was cleared. It wasn't forested or
Right,
anything.
exactly.
Yeah.
And then they started planting, and they planted what's called sour leaf or chinbao in Burmese. And again, the American congregants or parishioners were unfamiliar with sour leaf. They're like, we don't know this plant. And they're like, it doesn't matter. We like it, and we want to grow it. But they also grew other things like zucchini, corn, tomatoes, squash, whatever they didn't consume themselves at home, they started selling their crops to farmers markets and local grocery stores. And the sour leaf ended up being the most profitable crop, surprisingly, to the Americans. So the refugee farm sort of saved the church because not only did the congregation quadruple in size because the Karen refugees started attending church and bringing their friends and their new immigrant network to attend the church services, but they were also working this farm. So they were working on the farm mostly voluntarily to supplement their own diets, but their main employment was at meat packing plants in the area. So they were working for corporatized agribusiness, working either poultry or beef packing, meat processing. The parishioners at the All Saints Church were trying to help their new neighbors and the Karen immigrants learn English and, just sort of American survival skills, like how do you apply for a driver's license, helping them with paperwork at the welfare office. And they ended up, because so many of them were employed at the Tyson chicken factory, they had a whole lesson on chicken parts, like what are the names for the different parts of the chicken that the refugees were working in the factories and cutting up. They would work at the factories for paid employment, then come home, work on the farm after work or on weekends. So a lot of them were doing kind of double shifts. The farm was successful. The Episcopalian diocese decided, maybe we don't need to close this church. Maybe we need to invest in this growing population of new Christians that we didn't know about. Not that the Karen were newly Christian, but they were a discovery for the Tennessee Episcopalian diocese. So
yeah, that's quite a story. And you do a close reading of the film and the book and talk about some of the different narratives that show up. But the story itself of what happened is quite interesting.
It's fascinating, yeah.
And you also point out that the farm also served to kind of vary and improve the diets of the people there so they're not just succumbing
reliant
to the
on
American
McDonald's.
Yeah. And the sour leaf, was it profitable because the locals were discovering it and were like, oh, this is pretty good, I never had this? Or was it more that it was being sold to Asian markets and folks who were already familiar with it but weren't able to find it before?
They were able to sell the sour leaf crop to Asian grocery stores in the area. And I think different Asian populations either recognized the plant or were willing to try it as part of their culinary repertoire. I'm still in the process of researching to what degree sour leaf is popular among other Asian populations outside of Burma or Burmese folks. So that research is yet pending, but they were also able to sell the other crops to farmers markets. And as I mentioned, things like tomatoes and corn and things that go over well in an American farmer's market. So.
And it sounds like it was a successful farm.
Yeah.
All the work that I do, I talk to a lot of farmers, and farming's hard.
It is hard.
It's really hard to be successful, especially financially.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, if all these people are just volunteering their labor and the land is free, that cuts down on the cost quite a bit. So what you're bringing in is going to be more profitable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They weren't reliant on the farm in terms of their only source of income. As I mentioned, they had jobs at the poultry factory or, beef factories. So they were doing other work that also was a source of income for them.
Yeah. So it sounds like they were doing it, one, to supply their own kitchens with good food, and two, maybe, or at least how it turned out, to help the church.
I don't think the refugees' initial aim or goal was to assist the church, but certainly the fact that they reinvigorated a church that had dwindled down to less than 20 people and were able to generate some profit from selling their crops certainly got the attention of the Episcopalian diocese and gave them a different model to consider in terms of growing their network, right? Because, across the United States, even today, there's a decline in affinity towards religion.
And are you yourself familiar with sour leaf?
I am.
Uh-huh.
I am.
What is it like?
It's basically what it sounds like. It's a sour leaf. So I think it's a form of hibiscus, actually. It has about 10 different names. It's not only used in Southeast Asian cuisine and cooking, but is also popular in Caribbean diets as well as some African diets.
And is it like a big leaf? Is it kind of small? Like, is it red? Is it...
No, it's definitely
is it
green. When it's cooked, it sort of looks like spinach.
Do you know if there are other examples of this kind of community gardens cropping
absolutely.
up at church?
There are refugee gardens and community farms in Georgia, in New York, in Oregon. So I've seen a number of stories as well as examined websites of different endeavors in multiple U.S. states. There's one very famous place called Jubilee, which I believe is in Georgia. And there have been a number of stories, journalistic stories, written about the refugees who have gone to work at that farm. And the interviews with the refugees have displayed the degree to which farming, although being hard labor, it's also a form of kind of reparative ritual and therapy. We know that there are all sorts of good chemicals that come out of the dirt and working the land and working with plants that are beneficial to our mood and our health. But I think for refugee populations that have had to be on the run, who have had to live in refugee camps for decades, having a little piece of land that you can tend to, that you can take care of, and then see the results and not feel like you're going to be bombed out the next day is, it brings a kind of peace of mind and a little bit of healing that a lot of the refugees, I think, are very gratified and that they benefit from. And the other thing about a lot of the ethnic minority populations is that they themselves come from agrarian traditions. So many of them back in their homelands, when they were able to live in Burma or Myanmar, they had their own gardens. They had their own village gardens, their own community gardens. One narrative that I found when I was doing my research was, although the Karen have been on the run for the better part of more than half a century, there's an anecdote that they will drop seeds wherever they are so that the next population that has to run through that area will have plants that they can harvest and grow and eat and benefit from. So they're sort of used to farming on the run.
And farming for not themselves.
They're,
yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
My guest is Tammy Ho, professor of Gender and Sexuality Studies at UC Riverside. More from our conversation after a short break. You're tuned to Earth Eats. I'm Kate Young, and my guest is Tammy Ho. She's a Gender and Sexuality Studies professor at UC Riverside, and her current research is on Burmese refugees and their participation in the U.S. food system. Her third case study focuses on Burmese refugee labor in the meat processing industry. Starting in 2006, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, launched an aggressive immigration enforcement policy beginning with a series of raids at large-scale meatpacking plants, who were in the habit of employing undocumented migrants, primarily from Central and South American countries. Following this crackdown, the meatpacking industry faced a labor shortage. Here's Tammy.
The companies had to figure out who's going to do this labor, right? Where can we find a population that's willing to work in very hard, dangerous conditions? They turned to refugees, because the thing about refugees that have been resettled in the United States is they're here legally. They are supposed to be here.
And they're supposed to be working.
So And they're also willing to work and do hard work that many Americans would perhaps not want to do. They started working with the U.S. resettlement agencies to offer employment to these newly resettled refugees that have been allowed entry into the United States. And so, welfare and refugee resettlement only go so far, and then they're supposed to kind of develop some independence and find their own way to pay for rent, etc.
Yeah, in some cases, like within 3 months or something.
Exactly.
Absurd.
Yeah, so companies like JBS and Tyson recruit these refugees.
And in some cases, the companies work directly with refugee resettlement agencies to place workers in their plants. There's a huge population of refugees working at meatpacking plants in Greeley, Colorado, but also here in Indiana. The resettlement organization Exodus Refugee Immigration placed Burmese workers in a Tyson Foods pork processing plant in Logansport, Indiana. Burmese refugees originally settled in Fort Wayne, Indiana, make a 2-hour-plus trek to Logansport to work in the plant.
The Midwest has an appeal in terms of social services, in terms of employment, in terms of communities that have already been established here since 1988. So
maybe lower cost housing.
Yes, definitely
Not
lower
always,
cost
but sometimes.
housing. Yeah, that is also a big draw. So all of those have been pull factors in terms of refugee populations moving. And, even if they're not geographically close to a meatpacking factory, the refugees will sort of pool their resources and commute together, which unfortunately was also part of what led to the proliferation of COVID infection among some of these workers during the early days of the pandemic, 2020. One of the cases that I talked about in my talk and in my article is that of Tin A, who was a Karen refugee who had lived in a refugee camp for over a decade, and she ended up settling in Denver. But she found a job at a meatpacking factory in Greeley, Colorado, which is 60 miles away. But she would get in a van with other Karen refugees, do the commute, 60 miles there, 60 miles back. But she did it and was able to support her family and work. And then, unfortunately, it also led to COVID exposure. And because JBS had a very punitive policy about working while sick and did not provide workers with any sort of protective equipment.
By punitive, you mean they needed to work even if they were sick?
Exactly. So they were told to work even if they felt sick. And they were actually even told that they couldn't take bathroom breaks. So the idea was you have to stay on the line and keep working. And if you don't work, you're not going to get paid. So there were no paid sick leave allowances at JBS.
The meat processing became an essential service. And so they were allowed to keep their factories running, even though they were COVID hotspots, and they weren't either provided with or it wasn't insisted that they provide all of the protections that they possibly could to keep workers safe. And so workers were getting sick and workers were dying.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them were refugees.
Exactly. For me, that was one of the kind of startling discoveries during the pandemic. We were certainly well aware that frontline healthcare workers were putting their lives at risk by doing their jobs. And we knew that grocery store workers as well. But in terms of meat processing labor, as Professor Elizabeth Dunn has mentioned, that is labor that most Americans don't want to see and is intentionally invisibilized to the average passerby, right? The factories are not advertising that this is where that kind of, some people consider it gruesome labor is being performed. What startled me during some of the reports that were being shared by, say, like the New York Times about COVID-related deaths across the United States was every now and then you would see a percentage that was Asian, right? Because we knew that Black and Latinx populations were being exposed and dying prematurely at rates higher than, say, whites and Asians. But at the same time, there was always sort of a small percentage of Asians. And I started to examine it. I'm like, I know those are Burmese workers at the meat packing factories. And this was all over the United States, in North Dakota, in Colorado, in Georgia, probably in Iowa and Indiana, Minnesota. But because the data was not disaggregated, and because most people know the kind of big five Asian populations, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, maybe Vietnamese, Burmese is not on most people's radar. Tracing and disaggregating that data is one of my endeavors as part of this research project.
Yeah, and you talked about the difference in terms of perceptions and model minority views of Asian immigrants, and that when we're talking about refugees and we're talking about people who maybe don't have as much education or were, like you said, a part of an agrarian community, they're going to occupy a different place in American society when they come here.
Exactly. But what was interesting to me as well in the Tin A case that I mentioned in Colorado, in Greeley, Colorado, was that the way the union for the factory workers mobilized to not only honor those who had died prematurely of COVID or from COVID infection, but also the support that they gave to the workers and their families, and that this is a situation in which refugees from Myanmar or Burmese immigrants can form solidarity, both lived solidarity as well as kind of political and economic solidarity with Latino populations and other white working class populations that are also placed in, the kind of same situation of precarity and risk because of socioeconomic status.
Do you know much at this point about the Burmese refugees who have settled in Indiana or even in Bloomington?
My first visit to Bloomington was actually to look at their oral history archive here, because they had recorded a number of interviews and oral histories with former student activists who had left Burma in 1988. So in 1988, there were a series of actions by the military dictatorship and government that continuously disenfranchised people. One of the things the dictator did, for example, was he decided to change all the money. And this was based on superstition and numerology. He just decided none of the money was good. He was going to issue new bills that were based on the number 8, because that was considered kind of a lucky number. So overnight, if you had cash reserves, they were literally worthless. People lost life savings and bank accounts, and then there were other crackdowns on taxes on farmers and different workers, and so the people were fed up and they had enough. And I think there was a student at the university who perhaps was either beaten up by some soldiers or killed, and then it just erupted. So it started with student protests, and then they were joined by many other ranks: farmers, middle-class workers, healthcare workers. So 8/8/88, August 8th, 1988, is a day that lives in infamy in Burmese history as one of the moments when the country took to the streets and fought back against military dictatorship, which is why subsequently, when the military was able to kind of crush that revolution, they changed the name of the country from Burma to Myanmar, with the kind of ostensible logic that they were shedding the kind of legacy of British colonialism, because the British had named the country Burma. They said, no, we're going to give it a facelift. We're now Myanmar, which supposedly at the time was claimed to be more indigenous. So the government kind of tried to rebrand itself by giving the country a new name. But it was really the kind of same logic of unjust rule and corruption and dictatorship by the military leadership. So after 1988, a number of the students who had fled to the borders of Burma and to the jungles outside of the urban centers, they ended up leaving the country. And many of them ended up resettling in the Midwest. And part of it was that universities in the Midwest were actually very interested in recruiting international students. So they were able to come to places like Bloomington and Indianapolis and DeKalb, Illinois, and get a bachelor's degree or get a master's degree or a law degree. So some historians who were here at Bloomington recorded some of these interviews with the student activists from 1988 who had settled in the Bloomington area. So that was actually my first visit to Bloomington, was to look at these oral history transcripts, because this was pre-digital, and the archive said, no, we won't scan them, we won't email them to you, you have to come and read them here. So I visited Bloomington and read the oral history archives. And then now, because Indianapolis has become a kind of hub or center for Chin minority immigrants, that a lot of Chin families who now have children, those kids are now getting degrees here at IU or at Purdue or,
Yeah, you mentioned Indianapolis, which I had not heard of.
Had you really?
No, I hadn't. So that was news to me. That was really interesting. And so that's just an area in Southport in Indianapolis, or South Indianapolis, where there's just a really huge concentration.
Yeah, so one Chin American scholar who's teaching at Yale, Dr. David Mo, anecdotally told me that he thinks there are 40,000 Chin who live in the Indianapolis area, which is actually a bigger estimate than I've seen in print.
Yeah, what I saw was 20,000 just on the south side.
Right.
In that Southport area, which is already pretty huge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing that's fascinating to me about the Chin population is, I think that because of limited vocabularies around ethnicity and racial difference, that sometimes when people see or hear about Chin in the United States, they assume you mean Chinese, or there's a sort of slippage, right?
Yes. Similar to what you talked about with the Karen.
Yes, exactly. So Karen gets mistaken or conflated with Korean, and Chin sometimes slips into or is assumed to be kind of similar to Chinese or the same as Chinese.
What are some of the other things you're thinking about looking at, and do you think they will all be food related?
Some other options and suggestions, which may end up materializing as chapters in my book project, are looking at Burmese restaurants and also cookbooks or chefs. There are, I think, some really interesting chefs of Burmese ancestry that I've been tracking and following via the internet. And then certainly there are Burmese restaurants that are incredibly popular, particularly in the Bay Area, in San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley. So that's one possible chapter. And then cookbooks are another very popular source for food studies. The other story that I'm interested in thinking a little bit more about or bringing into the conversation is also transnational circuits of food. There was a Pulitzer Prize award-winning expose done by Associated Press journalists of Burmese migrants that had been enslaved on Thai fishing boats to basically fish for the Thai fishing industry, and then that fish was then sold around the world and ended up in American grocery stores, purchased and consumed by U.S. citizens and American consumers who probably did not know that their fish and their pet food had been harvested by people who had been enslaved.
Yeah, that story was really disturbing to hear, because it sounded like it was people really being held captive, like physically.
Exactly. Yeah, they were being held in cages with chains and shackles around their legs and arms. So it was quite a gripping story. And the Associated Press reporters that followed this story were amazing. Actually, all female, which was even more fascinating to me as a gender studies scholar.
So you think that might be one of the chapters in the book as
Yeah,
well?
I'd like to talk about that. I mean, honestly, they have their own book,
Right,
because of course,
sure.
They published their investigative journalism first as articles and then collected them in their own publication. But Not many folks talk about it or know about it, so I would like to bring it into my project as well.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems connected if you're talking about food systems and the way in which refugees from Burma are participating in it and involved. I just want to thank you so much for talking with me about this. I just really have enjoyed the way that your thinking puts all these things together and also the way that you've made it so accessible.
Well, thank you for your interest, and I've really enjoyed our conversation. I'm pleased and honored to be part of the Earth Eats dialogue.
That was Tammy Ho, professor of Gender and Sexuality Studies at University of California-Riverside, talking about her research on Burmese refugees in the United States and their participation in our food system. Find links to her work and more at eartheats.org. The Earth Eats team includes Violet Barron, Eobon Binder, Alexis Carvajal, Alex Chambers, Mark Chilla, Toby Foster, Daniela Richardson, Samantha Schemenauer, Peyton Whaley, and Harvest Public Media. Earth Eats is produced and edited by me, Kate Young. Our theme music is composed by Aaron Toby and performed by Aaron and Matt Toby. Additional music on the show comes to us from Universal Production Music. Our executive producer is Eric Bolstridge.